Thank you to everyone who's out there. I've seen some things, questions in the chat. Please let me know your questions. I'll do my very best to answer them. You're all adult learners. I'm here to try and share some information that I have, and I'm really keen that we tailor it to your needs as much as possible. My name's Tim. I'm a consultant in emergency medicine and a consultant in pre-hospital emergency medicine. I spend about half my time working in the emergency department and half my time working on an air ambulance, where my work is split between clinical and also leadership, where I'm the lead doctor for the Devon Air Ambulance. And I've got an interest in research, and particularly focused on extrication and immediate interventions, which might, we hope, save lives from people injured by trauma. So I've put this talk together specifically for tonight, and is kind of my latest thoughts on the evidence and approach. And I've tried to make it interesting and engaging, but I'm really happy to, no worries, Paul. I'm really happy to try and tailor it as we go along. So if you want a particular focus on a particular slide, or you've got any questions, I'll try and pick them up, and we're going to try and leave 20 minutes or so at the end. A lot of the work that I'm going to talk about has been a result of a project which I put together called the EXIT project, or the Extrication and Trauma project. And what that does is it's a multidisciplinary group of pre-hospital practitioners, operational firefighters, trauma experts, people with an interest in this area, biomechanists, statisticians, data scientists, who have helped answer some of the questions around extrication. And a significant amount of that work and the publication and costs associated with it have been funded by the Road Safety Trust. So we're very grateful for them. And the National Fire Chiefs Council has acted as the executive sponsor for much of that work. So we're going to talk about extrication. So I've seen from the chat that a significant number of you have got pre-hospital experience, paramedics, background in motorsport, rescue technicians. And we're going to talk specifically about extrication from motor vehicles this evening. And why is this important? So motor vehicle collisions are the leading cause of death between the ages of 5 and 25 globally. About somewhere between 10 and 40% of patients following a motor vehicle collision will be trapped in some way, whether that be medically trapped or physically trapped. And those of you who spent significant time on the road, those of you who've seen people who are trapped, those of you who have witnessed people die in their vehicles or die on the way to hospital, will know that this is an area where perhaps we could do better. If you felt that frustration of seeing someone trapped by their legs and pass away whilst we cut the vehicle from around them, those patients who perhaps if we did something sooner, we might have made a difference to. Those patients, perhaps we'd identified their sickness, their badness earlier, we may have made a difference. Then you would have felt the same frustrations, which kind of got me started on this project. And my key, if you like, driver for this project was, one, having a number of experiences like I've just described, and two, seeing a mismatch between what I experienced as an emergency physician working in hospital and as a pre-hospital doctor, and the time I spent training and working the fire and rescue services, and what their concerns about injuries were, and the reality of the injuries that I was seeing. And it just seemed to be a mismatch. And as a result of that mismatch, differences in opinion or differences in approach. And that's what the EXIT project is about. And we've looked more deeply into this area of practice. So these are the things which I'm hoping to cover this evening. So we talk a little bit about the history of extrication, some of the evidence behind it or lack of evidence behind it, and then common injuries which are associated with motor vehicle collisions and entrapment. I'm going to talk about how extrication performs in real life, both in terms of time it takes and the biomechanics of it. Talk about the importance of communication, both to our patients and with each other when we're on scene. Talk about UK guidance, which has been adopted and being used elsewhere in the world. And then, as I said, I'm hoping there's going to be some time at the end for questions. So part one, the history and evidence and the injuries. And it's important to know the background of where we've come from. It's important to know what the evidence is for our current approaches. And it's important to know the injuries, because without knowing about the injuries, we don't know how appropriate any approach might be and how we might tailor our therapies. So where has extrication come from? So the evidence here is a result of what's called a systematic scoping review, which is where you work with librarians and specialists in grey literature to define a search strategy. We looked at over 7,000 documents. This is a very poor summary of it. But we've had manuals from the States, manuals from the 60s, 70s, fire and rescue manuals, grey literature, automobile, design work, all sorts of bits and pieces. And there's effectively, there's a really interesting history of extrication. So as you'd expect, it follows that of the motor vehicle. You have motor vehicles, people start crashing them, people get trapped. The first recorded extrication I can find was a patient got trapped, partially ejected, and trapped under their vehicle and ended up having an amputation. And that was back in the early 1900s. And over time, we see data being collected on motor vehicle collisions. We see a move from informal extrication, so by members of the public, by police services, commonly by mechanics, and we see the fire and rescue services becoming more deeply involved and then formally being commissioned to do that work. And then in the 1970s, we see a move from using conventional tools for extrication and modifying them perhaps a small amount to specific tools being invented and used. And Holmatro patented the jaws of life, which we'll all know, those big cutting tools, well, cutting and stretching tools, in 1971. And then over the 80s and 90s, something strange starts to happen. So if you read anything pre-1980, which is about extrication or about the injuries associated with motor vehicle collision, it will say there's head injuries, there's chest injuries, there's abdominal injuries. And then if you read anything post, particularly kind of 1990, early kind of 92, 94 onwards, it will say we're worried about the cervical spine, and then people have other injuries as well. Not just cervical spine, sorry, the spine and the spinal cord. And we see this change, and it's difficult to know where this change comes from. But what's been fascinating to me is that change hasn't come from a change in injury pattern. So I'd assume that change came about because there was a change in injury pattern as a result of seat belts, central safety zones, crumple zones, changes in car design. But that's not the case. And when we look at old data, so pre-seat belts, or we look at data from perhaps lower income countries where people are less likely to wear seatbelts or less likely to have a car of a high NCAP rating, the injury pattern. So once you get a transfer of energy, which overcomes the car safety systems and overcomes your individual tissue tolerance, you end up with very similar injuries and very similar patterns of injuries, which will depend on the vector of the crash and will depend on the delta V, the change in velocity, and the things that we talked about, so individual tissue tolerance, the safety of the car and the safety of the system. But actually, once you get energy transfer, you get injuries, and those injuries look very similar. But anyway, something strange happens in 1990, and we see an absolute focus on movement minimization. And we see the introduction of spinal boards, cervical collars, slow extrication techniques, and the patients becoming medically trapped. So we move from just formally extricating people who are physically trapped, the vehicle has changed shape to keep them in, to extricating people even when there's been no intrusion or they're not physically trapped, but they're medically trapped because of pain, because of fear of cord injury, because of fear of exacerbating injuries. And then we end up with today's current situation, which is luckily, I've been giving talks like this for 10 or so years now, and there's definitely changes, and that's really great to see. So why might we worry about spinal injury? And I think it's really important to know that there's a whole range of spinal injuries. And just like you can go from, a mild sniffle to full-blown sepsis, you can go from a small transverse process fracture or a spinous process fracture, just taking off this little bit of bone here, which is a spine fracture, but can be treated like a soft tissue injury, to having most of this column stuck in your cord and having severe paralysis or death. So there's this huge spectrum of injury, and we've got to be really careful that when we're saying to people, oh, that patient had a spinal fracture, that we're talking about the same sort of thing. And what we're really interested in is injury which affects this bit in the middle here. So things which affects the integrity of these bones to the point that it compromises the cord. And effectively, if the cord's not compromised, it might be a significant injury, but it's not going to be helped by a movement minimization technique. It's going to be potentially, it's going to cause other issues. But the important thing is that cord in the middle. So it's important that we're using the same nomenclature. And because of worry about of neck injuries, particularly, and cord injuries, we see the modern approach to extrication, or perhaps now a slightly outdated approach to extrication, I like to think, where we focus on absolute movement minimization. So you'll see firefighters in vehicles or clinicians in vehicles holding fully conscious patients head still. We see ubiquitous use of collars. We see roof-off type extrication techniques on people who've already self-extricated. And we were chatting just before this conference about multiple examples of that. And we'll see training techniques where you put a glass on the dashboard and you make sure that it doesn't wobble or spill when you're extricating a patient around it. And this focus on absolute movement minimization has been ubiquitous for 20, 25 years, if not longer, and has spread throughout the world. And it's really difficult to track down where that occurred or why that happened. But I can tell you quite definitively that it's not based on any evidence. So having looked at these 7,000 sources and having looked at databases of spinal cord injuries and spinal injuries and motor vehicle collisions throughout the world, I can tell you that there was no change in injury distribution, that there was no change in terms of spinal cord frequency of injury. The incidence rose, as you would expect, alongside the ubiquitous use of motor vehicles, but with that also rose proportionally the number of head injuries and chest injuries and abdominal injuries. And it's interesting, when you take these concepts and when you track them all the way back through time and you find that there's no evidence for them, or you find that something's quoted and you follow that quote back through time, back through the decades and back through the editions of books, those statistics which don't exist, where you can't find their source, where there's something quoted and it's not quite as given, that's called a zombie statistic. And that's why we've got those scary people on the left of your screen. And these zombie statistics absolutely pervade the ideas around extrication. And effectively, there's no evidence for them. They're wrong. It's made up. It's based on expert opinion. And I strongly believe that expert opinion is incorrect and wrong. And I'm going to talk to you through why I think that tonight and hopefully convince you, if you're not already convinced. I suspect most of you convinced already that is the case. So it's really important to know about the injuries, and we particularly need to know a bit about cord injuries and spinal injuries, because that helps us give us context to this issue around movement minimization. Because if movement minimization is important, then it must be that patients benefit from it, and it must be that spinal cord injuries are common, because otherwise you're focusing just on one injury at the deficit of other injuries. And we know injuries must be time dependent, and they must be time dependent because we rush to get patients to major trauma centres. We rush to get enhanced sources to scene. We rush to get patients to theatre to stop their bleeding. And we know that they do better when we do those things. So a majority of injuries which are likely to kill you have a time dependent factor to it. And therefore, because movement minimization takes time, we need to get that balance right. Has anyone else lost the video from Tim? Looks like it's still working here. Can someone confirm?
Yeah, still broadcasting, Tim, perfectly.
Still broadcasting, thank you. Sorry, Mike. Right, so these are free papers which you can find free and open access online. Oh, I can see some chat in the chat coming through. Can hear and not see. It looks like it's a varied problem. I do apologise for those who can't see. I'll try to explain what I'm going. I can see there's lots of chat. I'm going to keep going. So understanding injuries is really important. These are free papers. They're all free and open access. If you Google the title, you'll find them. I can put QR codes and share them with CPDB, so you've got those, but you can find them easily. Can't see you, but can see the research papers. Okay, that's fine. That's the important bit. So what are the important injuries? So the summary of those, the important injuries associated with extrication, the most common injury which will kill you is a head injury. The second injury, which you might like to call you, is a chest injury, then an abdominal injury, and then a pelvis injury, and then a limb injury. Thank you, Simon Worth. And at the bottom, you've got spinal injuries and facial injuries. So this is the order of frequency, but also quite often order of the likelihood to kill you. And if you've got an extradural, like you can see in the picture, if you've got this expanding bleeding vessel in your brain, then that is time dependent, and that is a priority injury, and you need to get to a neurosurgeon to stop to that bleeding and take that clot out. If you've got a liver injury like you see here, and a spleen which is mush like you see here from a lap belt type injury, a rapid deceleration injury, early TXA is going to be really useful. Perhaps you might, if you were in a service which carries lyolized plasma or whole blood, you're going to give that and get that going. But effectively, this patient needs to be ideally in a major trauma centre where you've got an interventional radiologist or you've got a surgeon who can stop that bleeding. And that isn't going to get better in a car. And the more you bleed, the more likely you are to die. And the more you bleed, the more likely you are to have complications. So we want to stop that bleeding early and minimize that. And those are the injuries which pervade the literature, and those are the injuries which, looking at the Trauma Audit Research Network, but also looking at the global burden of disease data, are most common in this population. One of the analyses that we did is we compared patients who were trapped with similarly injured patients, so from the UK, which from 2012 onwards, who were injured in a motor vehicle collision but not trapped. So all these people have been in their car, they've not been ejected, they've not been in a motorbike collision, they've not been run over. These are similar groups of patients. We looked at those who are trapped and not trapped. And you can model the effects of different physiology, different injuries, different ages, and all this other data which the Trauma Audit Research Network holds. And then you can compare like patients. So you can say, what's the difference? What's the real difference between this group and that group? And is there a mortality difference? And there is a significant mortality difference. So if you are trapped following a motor vehicle collision, if all other things are equal, you are much more likely to die. That's a difficult thing because it's when people die, that's difficult. It's what that difference does mean, though, is that it should be amenable to change. So there's something about being trapped that if we get better, if we can make improvements in that area, then we should see that mortality difference disappear. And we're doing pieces of work now to track that against extrication type, working with the Home Office and working with TARN, and we'll have that data out, and we're hoping to publish on a yearly basis. So as extrication practice changes, and we really are seeing it change, we've seen a huge move across to self-extrication, which is brilliant. We will show you the difference that makes to mortality, and I'm hoping that's going to be a good one. The other thing which I think is really interesting to know is if you think about systolic blood pressures, 129 versus 133, respiratory rate 21 versus 22. So these things have all got massive p-values. They're massively statistically significant, but these to me are just not clinically significant values. Oxygen saturation is 94.8 versus 96.3. And what's really interesting is once you exclude the really sick patients, which are obvious, you've got blood pressure of 60, we know you're sick. You've got GCS of 4, we know you're sick. You've got SATs of 20%, we know you're in a world of badness. Once you exclude those who are obviously horribly injured, and you end up with this group, it's really amorphous. And within that group, you cannot, from physiology, distinguish those who are going to be dead at 24 hours and those who are going to be alive beyond 24 hours and have really good outcomes. So this idea of clinical stability, this idea that the observations are useful, isn't really it doesn't really stack up. So do think about, and we'll talk about this a bit later on, do think about the utility of your monitoring. Is the patient really sick? Yeah, they need to come out really quick. Are they not really sick? The observations aren't going to be particularly useful to determine those are very, very sick versus those are sick. And we know the utility of clinical exam in the context of an intrapped patient as well is close to useless. So spinal injuries, I'm really conscious of time. I do like talking about this, so I'm going to rattle on. But effectively, the rate of spinal injuries, look at this number here. Cord injuries, that bit in the middle that we're really worried about. Of all extrications performed in the UK across this, I think it was 10 years-ish, 0.7% of them were cord injury. I've seen someone else in this in the chat say they've only seen one patient with a cord injury, and of all those patients with a cord injury, about half of them have got another time-dependent injury. So even once you get to the point, if you think that 0.7% are important, of course they're important, everyone's important, but we do also need to think about the 99.3% of patients who might be harmed by spending longer in their vehicle because of movement minimization. Even once you take that into account, the principles of looking after your spinal cord are maintaining oxygenation and maintaining blood flow. If you've got a devastating head injury, if you've got a horrible chest injury, if you've got a horrible abdominal injury from your lap belt associated with your spinal cord injury, then we're not going to be able to look after your spinal cord until we solve those other problems. So the number of patients who might benefit from movement minimization is tiny. This is a piece of work which is live at the moment. It's not being published yet, but I'm hoping we're going to get it out there in the future. Some of the challenge we've had around the extrication project, people have gone, okay, that's great. You've got good data in the UK. What about the rest of the world? We think spinal cord injuries are a big problem elsewhere in the world. And I can tell you they're not. So this is a percentage of spinal cord injuries of total injuries. This is brand new data, analysis done this week. And you can see that actually this is the UK. We're about in the middle, 1.4% of spinal cord injuries. So this is all patients with motor vehicle collision with major injury. What percent of those major injuries are spinal cord injuries? UK, about 1.4%. Elsewhere in the world, the maximum is around about 1.6, 1.65%, and most of them are much less than that. The distribution isn't related to higher income countries versus low middle income countries. We're trying to work out if it's to do with ANCAP rating or something like that. But across the world, the rate of spinal cord injury associated with motor vehicle collision is very small, and the rate of other time-dependent injuries is very high. So we're just coming towards the end of this section of the talk. What are my takeaways? Extrication, trapped patients, more likely to die. No evidence base whatsoever for our current approach to extrication. No evidence base as to why we would do things this way. Head injuries, chest injuries, abdominal injuries, pelvis injuries, far, far, far more common than spinal cord injuries. And think about how you might treat those injuries. And it doesn't involve sitting in the car for a prolonged period of time. And the rate of spinal cord injuries is very low internationally. Could it just be poor data recording? I take the point that, and we will kind of dig into that later on. It may well be poor data recording, but if it is, that data recording is ubiquitous, and it would mean that someone or people or everywhere was purposely recording just spinal cord injuries poorly, because this is about the proportion of them compared to the other injuries that have been defined. So I don't think it's the case. Definitely there's poorer quality of data in some parts of the world. There's no doubt about that. But actually, it kind of all matches in every part of the world, even when we know there's really good quality data recording. And the Trauma Audit Research Network in the UK, that is how major trauma centres are funded. So you can't get paid for a trauma patient, and it's important that hospitals get paid unless you submit to TARN. And with modern, multimodal imaging techniques and trauma scans, we're good at picking them up. So, so I take the point that it could be poor data, but the places where there's really good high quality data and the places where there's perhaps less poor data seem to match really well. And I think we'd see significant changes between the countries. And we'd see some places above that 1.65% if that was the case. So extrication, how does it perform in real life? So we've done quite a bit of work around this as well. So we've worked with various fire and rescue services, both urban and rural, both majority retained or full-time firefighters, and looked at how extrication techniques perform in real life. I can tell you, on average, extrication in the UK takes between 30 and 32 minutes, depending on how you do your analysis. And that's pretty much standard across every data set and however way we've cut it. And during that 30 minutes, that's a long time to be stuck in the vehicle. So I've got 30 minutes when a patient arrives in my major trauma centre to complete the resuscitation, get them stable enough, get them intubated if required, get any surgical procedures done, and get them through the CT scanner. That is the national quality standard. 30 minutes is considered important. You don't want to spend that 30 minutes entrapped if you can help it. We've done another piece of work looking at those patients who are physically trapped versus medically trapped. And at least 90% of the patients in the UK population are medically trapped and not physically trapped. So they could probably come out for another route. Moving on, how do current techniques work? So this is 4 other studies that we've done. Once again, they're all free and open access. And they consider the biomechanics of different extrication techniques. So the current extrication techniques that we employ, how do they perform? There's been previous work done in this area. We've done very big studies with hundreds of extrications across tens of volunteers of different backgrounds, males, females, different BMIs, different ages, 23 youngest volunteers, 78 oldest volunteer, and we've extricated them many hundreds of times, thousands of times actually. And we've also done this with different techniques as well. So we've used different methods of image capture and movement capture, and the results are the same effectively, whichever way you do it. Different techniques are considered. So we've got we've done some work around the Norwegian chain cabling techniques, where you cut the top of the A post and you cut a relief cut here. And I've got a video because it kind of makes much more sense. A video compared roof off type extrication, kind of B post rips. So you can see here where the B post is removed, and then also snatch type rescue. So minimum cutting. You might remove the door. You might just push the door back and just take the patient out the quickest way. And then very importantly, also self extrication. I've got a quick video here, which I hope will play. Don't worry about the sound. So this is us just doing one of our experiments. So you can't see the biomechanical sensors on this person because they're covered in the PPE. But this is replicating Norwegian chain cabling techniques. So the A-posts are being cut at the top. There's a relief cut down at the bottom here. And you can see that it's stretched between 2 winches. This is one of the techniques which we couldn't repeat many, many times because each time we needed a new car, and that starts to get expensive. But it just shows you the sort of work that we were getting up to. This is a video of what you can produce if you've got someone in a full biomechanical monitoring kit like we did. So you can do these models. This model is of a self-extrication. And if you do this hundreds and hundreds of times, you build up a very accurate idea of movement. And you do this across many volunteers, you get an idea as well. Yes, they do have creepy eyes, and then you do get, and then you can take measurements from those models. So you've just seen self-extrication. This model here is, it's not playing, oh no, it's self-extrication again. I do apologize. This one here is a roof-off type extrication. So you can see someone racking back the seat onto a spinal board or a phono scoot, whichever you prefer. And then you won't see the movement because it's all in proportion to each other, but they're being gently lifted up at the moment. You can see the legs have just come free of the pedals, and then they'll go up the board, and then eventually they'll get laid down on the ground at the end of the there you go, at the end of the experiment. As I said, many hundreds of times, many different techniques, and we're pretty confident that we're pretty happy that we can be confident in our results. I've only got one slide on the results because all the results look exactly the same. And this is looking at AP, so forward backward movement at cervical spine, which you would consider the most important movement in terms of potential for exacerbating a cord injury at that level. At the top here, you've got roof off extrication. The x-axis is millimeters movement, and then we've got roof off extrication, B post rip, rapid extrication, and self extrication. And this is millimeters of forward backward movement of the spine. These are called 95% confidence intervals. So when you do enough, once you do something hundreds of times and you power a study to know how many hundreds of times you do it, you can draw these 95% confidence intervals. And effectively, that means that you can say with 95% confidence that the true value lies within these 2 brackets. If this was pre-hospital pain, and this was paracetamol, and this was morphine, and this was ketamine, you would say that all 3 of these drugs perform the same. That's because the 95% intervals crossed. So if you did a trial and you found that the 95% intervals crossed, you'd say this was a negative study. So what is the conclusion from this? The conclusion from this is that roof-off extrication and B post rip and rapid extrication all perform the same. So all other things being equal, if you have to choose one of these techniques, then none of them performs better or worse in terms of movement. So then you would focus on other things like what's going to be most comfortable for the patient, or what I thought more likely, what's going to take the least amount of time, both in terms of getting this injured patient to hospital, but also freeing up your resources. And that, if they're unconscious or can't self-extricate, it's going to be rapid extrication. But for a vast majority of patients, that's going to be self-extrication. So self-extrication is quickest and is associated with the least movement of the spine. And we know that spinal cord injuries are very rare. So if your patient can self-extricate, then they should be offered that opportunity and supported. And do consider linking techniques as well. So say your patient is physically trapped by the dashboard, you can do, or with your working with your fire and rescue colleagues, you can do a dash roll to release that. And then if the patient's femur's been tapped, they can step out of that car, or they can be assisted with a gentle arm to help us step out from that car. Now, we've been working with UK Rescue Organisation and other groups about kind of how we capture that and how we train people to do it, because it is a bit of a step change, even though many of you have been self-extricating for many years. We're trying to make it the national standard, and that's supported by recent JRCALC guidance, and will be supported, I think, by next month by the it's out for consultation at the moment by the National Fire Chiefs Council National Operations Guidance. So those two sets of guidance use the same language and both recommend self-extrication where possible. And this is just a little you step out thing that we're working on at the moment to help with that education and training. Someone's put a link to one of my papers in the chat. Thank you. So how do extrication techniques perform in real life? So probably not as expected. Rapid extrication, beat post rip, all the extrication techniques are about the same. And in that, you can throw chain cabling as well, apart from self-extrication, which is biomechanically far superior. So do bear that in mind. If you are worried about spinal movement, the best thing that can happen is the patient to come out themselves. If you want the quickest technique, the best thing is that the patient does as much of that movement as possible. If you want the technique that the patient prefers the most, that's the patient coming out going out through a self-extrication approach. And patients with surprising number of injuries can self-extricate, including spinal injuries, including fractured femurs, including horrible chest injuries. And I think everyone out there who's spent significant periods on the road will have found an injured person 20 yards from their car, lying in the roadside or holding onto their legs or crumpled over slightly. And they turn out to have the most fantastic injuries, but have successfully self-extricated and got out of their car. And extrication takes time, 30 to 32 minutes in real life scenarios. It's much quicker with competition trained fire rescue people. It's much quicker in a competition environment, but in a real life environment, this is how long it takes. Finally, or almost finally, what's the importance of communication? So this came out really strongly, both in the paper that's been put in the chat, but also in spending lots of time with fire crews, spending lots of time at extrication courses, and spending lots of time recording real life extrications. Communication is really, really important. This road crash rescue, this is borrowed from an Australian group, which have done a lot of work around this and refined it over time. And this is what this is a prompt card, which they use at each extrication to try and make people talk about the same things. And when I say people, clinicians and rescue people, and if required, the police as well. And it's about setting out the priorities for that extrication. And my recommendation is, if you do arrive on scene as a clinician, and I think most of the people in the chat are clinicians, please make sure you introduce yourself. In the UK, it's going to be to the white top. Make sure you know who's in charge. Make sure you come up with a joint plan, and make sure you use commonly used language. So big sick, time critical, horribly injured. That's what they care about. I think if you're talking about, complex extradural, subdural, that's not language that necessarily translates. I find a few swear words is sometimes useful as well. And just setting the tempo and the speed at which someone needs to come out is really useful. Often, and I'm sure there's fire and rescue crews on the chat, what was really interesting in doing this research and engaging with operational firefighters and clinicians was that the clinicians thought that the fire and rescue services were responsible for the extrication and that the patient was a casualty until they came out, and that the fire and rescue services thought that the clinicians were responsible for setting the tempo and the priorities for the extrication. And I think that's a reason why not much work has been done in this area, is because it's been seen as other people's work, an area where areas where professional boundaries cross are really hard to look at. And I think this is why we've not really taken a step back and considered this area kind of deeply, perhaps previous to this work, is because of those challenges. But this needs to be a dual decision, and it needs to be focused on your patient and all the other things that are important. So how many vehicles involved, what are the vectors, what's been the change of velocity, what are the environmental factors, what resources you haven't seen, how far are you away from specialist resources, where's your major trauma centre, etc., etc., etc. And that's why you can't capture all of that in an SOP. So what we need to do is come up with a set of principles, and those principles might be patient-focused, self-extrication first, bespoke rescue for that technique, for that scene. And then we need to empower people to work within those boundaries and work within those principles, rather than saying it must look just like this, because that's not how real life works. And interesting, what we did find is when we've done our research is the slightly crazy extrications, when the car's upside down or on its roof or stuck somewhere, patient comes out really quick. And the patient comes out really quick because people come up with a bespoke rescue plan for that patient, rather than going back to their textbook and doing what comes, what they've trained to do again and again and again, i.e. a roof off type extrication. Also, the patients, this is what it's all about. We're really keen to reduce morbidity, injury. We're really keen to reduce mortality, death, but we also want to give our patients a really good experience. In this study, we interviewed patients who had been extricated, and we made sure that we had patients with cord injuries, and we worked with a spinal cord injury support charity to do that, and patients who didn't have cord injuries, which is obviously the vast majority of the patient population. And the patients wanted the same things. And what did they want? They wanted excellent communication. They wanted someone to hold their hand, tell them what was going on, use language that they understood, spend time in the car with them. They really appreciated having a buddy there. And that buddy probably should be a professional buddy in PPE, but they appreciated anyone in there telling them what was going on, holding their hands, because they were absolutely scared. Yeah, scared beyond all belief. This is a massive, massive life-changing event for them. Even if they've got relatively minor injuries, the psychosocial sequelae are massive. And they want someone in there to look after them whilst all this is going on. So please do bear that in mind. And these are some guidelines which we came up with following the work that we did with patients. So the importance of communication and companionship, the importance of an extrication buddy, using language which is accessible and that the patient understands, reassuring patients when you can that co-occupants are safe, and that includes animals, and allowing people to contact and communicate with their family members. Don't let people take photos of the vehicles. That was really distressing. Don't put photos of broken cars on your social media pages, or this is an extrication I went to last week. That's really distressing. And we found that follow-up, not formal psychological follow-up, but just chatting to the patient afterwards, letting them know what's going on. We found that many of them had very, very poor memories of events, even when they hadn't had significant amounts of painkillers or ketamine or anything like that at all. Like they liked filling in those gaps. So I'm aware of time. What does the guidance say? So we worked with the groups that you can see here. So this is very UK focused, but we worked with the College of Paramedics, Faculty of Pre-Hospital Care. That's all, you can see them there. And we came up with we performed a Delphi study, which is a way of achieving consensus across groups. And effectively, everyone interacts anonymously from each other, and they suggest statements and then vote on those statements. And as a result, you can achieve consensus. And I'd encourage you to have a look at this paper if you get a chance, but you can see the techniques that we used and how we came to consensus. And this is what the consensus was. So I've trimmed this down slightly just to make it more applicable to tonight and take out some of the data-driven outcomes. I agree with what Paul Robinson's saying there. So the extrication project consensus, operation and clinical team members should work together to develop a bespoke patient-centered extrication time with the primary focus of minimizing entrapment time, because we think that's what's killing people, is the time spent in the vehicle. And you can't accurately diagnose someone in the vehicle unless it's very obvious their legs have come off, in which case they need to come out very quickly anyway. And you can't adequately treat someone in the vehicle, so they need to come out quickly. Independent of actual suspected injuries, patients should be handled gently. A focus on absolute movement minimization is not justified. So treat people gently, treat them with respect. It's really important to handle people gently because that's a nice way to handle people if you're injured. It causes less pain. But also, if you do have a clot on your spleen, it's not good to wiggle it around too much. If you do have an unstable fracture, it's not nice to wiggle it around too much. So we do need to be really, really gentle. We're not saying drag patients out of cars. We're saying we need to be gentle with them, but we don't need to absolutely restrict their movement to nothing or the absolute minimum we can achieve, because that takes time and that causes harm. Self-extrication or minimally assisted extrication should be the standard first-line extrication of all patients who do not have contraindications. And the contraindications are really limited. So this is self-extrication for everyone, unless they can't understand the instructions. And you remember that you step out thing, one of the first things was, does the patient have an understanding? And you can check that just by, can you give me a thumbs up? If the person gives you a thumbs up, I can tell you they can understand you and they've got motor control and they're suitable for self-extrication. Like, it's very, very simple. If a patient can undo their window themselves, and I know it's not like this anymore, it's just pressing a button, that patient is, 99.999% of the time going to be someone who can self-extricate. This isn't a complex assessment. Things which means that you can't self-extricate are, I like this one, impalement, obviously, unstable pelvic fractures, which are really difficult to detect. So the way you know is the patient won't be able to physically self-extricate. They won't be able to swing their legs around in order to self-extricate, and bilateral leg fracture, just because that's cruel. Medical side of physical processes, yes, we could do something on that. And all patients with evidence of injury should be considered time dependent and their entrapment times minimized. So any injury at all, we can't judge the severity of the injury by what it looks like. So the OBS, they might be reassuring, but they're a lie. Patients deteriorate. We can't predict that deterioration. The value of clinical observations is close to minimal, apart from when they're really sick, when you didn't need them anyway. Instance where patients may require disentanglement and complex and should be have senior guidance, and then clinical care during entrapment. And I think this is what Cameron's talking about. We can talk about this, and that's the focus of the second part of the exit project. So there's two things going on now. Or three things. One is looking at the long-term effects of the changes in extrication practice and how that affects morbidity and mortality. The second is I'm doing a piece of work with the UN Road Safety Fund around how this work applies internationally, particularly in low and middle income countries where 95% of the deaths from road traffic collision occur. And then the third piece is around actually what care should we be delivering those immediate phases of care? And there's lots of really interesting stuff around that, which I'd happily come back and talk about. Fine. So what are my takeaways in the last couple of minutes? So my takeaways, there's an absence of evidence around why we currently extricate as we do. There is a really low rate of spinal injuries in the injured population. And head injuries, chest injuries, and abdominal injuries are going to be most of what you see and most of what kills people. Current extrication techniques, what we've been taught, I've been to many fire and rescue study days and practical days and training courses, and I've done my team leader course. Absolutely. So they don't perform as we expect, and they all perform about the same, apart from self-extrication, which is really which is by far the most superior technique. Clinical observations are useless, really. So if someone's really sick, you've all got clinical experience, you can probably tell from the end of the bed, the heart rate, the blood pressure, and that sort of stuff. Unless they're massively deranged, aren't going to help you predict that this patient's really sick. And you can't predict those who are going to crump and those aren't. I think over many years, you do build up a gestalt and go, that blood pressure might be all right and that heart rate might be all right, but this patient looks like crap and it's probably going to crump. And we need to either train that gestalt for everyone, or we need to assume injury, and we should probably assume injury and get someone out quick and have a proper look at them. Self-extrication for everyone, the importance of communication to our patients, hold their hand, provide a buddy, tell them what's going on, don't treat them like a sack of potatoes, handle them gently. They'll really, really appreciate it. And also, if you're involved in training, if you're being trained, try and make sure that your guidance supports freedom in this area. So this is a complicated, complex situation, which you're not going to capture in an algorithm. You might be able to capture the individual bits of it into an algorithm, but you will end up with 100 algorithms because it's so variable on the environment and the geographical location, the resources available, the vehicles, the vehicle types, the number of patients. The patient you've got, their age makes a difference, their sex makes a difference. All these things, the vector that they've been injured, the delta V, how quickly that velocity has changed, all makes a difference. You can't write that all down. So let's train people, let's teach them things like this, give them some principles to work by and empower them to follow them.